President Biden isn't the only leader arriving with political baggage. French President Emmanuel Macron lost seats in the National Assembly after calling for snap elections. He'll now have to share power with the far left. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also in a weaker position after his party took a beating during the European parliamentary elections. And the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is untested in power. His Labour Party was just given its first opportunity to govern in 14 years. Sir Peter Westmacott served as British ambassador to the US, France, and Turkey. He's also the author of They Call It Diplomacy, and he joins me now. We could surely use some during this meeting. A lot to navigate here. Either way, though, US leadership, if we start there, for NATO allies is in jeopardy. At the moment, the Democratic White House is in crisis. I note that before that, they had trouble getting military aid for Ukraine through Congress. And then, of course, there is the issue of a Trump presidency take two. You know, by your estimation, how nervous are NATO allies right now, and do you believe they should be?
Well, thanks for giving me the chance to talk a little bit about these issues, Paula. I think a lot of your visitors are arriving in Washington with some concern, not only about how the alliance is performing on the really big issues that matter strategically at the moment. The immediate one, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there's also the Middle East, which is not going well. And there's the big issue, which is on many people's minds, of what to do about China and what to do about the really very strong alliance that has now developed between China and Russia, with a bit of North Korea stirred into the mix as well. But as you've rightly pointed out, a lot of the leaders are arriving either with their own baggage or with just having arrived in power. And many are looking, probably don't really want to, but looking inevitably at the question of who is going to be the Democratic candidate for the US presidential elections on the 5th of November. So this is not really what the foreign heads of government want to do. They want to talk about how to strengthen NATO, how to deal with the global crises, how to work more effectively together, how to do something about capabilities, how to stand up more effectively to the Russians who are invading Ukraine. So all those issues should be on the agenda, but inevitably, the way the news cycle operates, people will be saying, well, how is President Biden actually performing? So it's obviously a big issue for him, but it's also something that's on the mind of the 32, I think it is, heads of government from NATO countries who will be turning up in Washington, in the nation's capital, tonight and tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, really, at the crux of this all, center stage is Russia and its war against Ukraine. President Trump, perhaps being the one who does not buy that NATO's existence right now is to deter Russia from further aggression. But there are others, even around the table, and I point out whether it's Turkey or Hungary, that perhaps might be a bit difficult to persuade. How important do you believe it is that NATO really buy into that and say, look, we need to do all we can to make sure that we are strong enough to act as a deterrent against further Russian aggression?
I think it's of critical importance. The Russian technique for many years, whether it's a Tsar or whether it's the communists or whether it's Vladimir Putin, has often been, let's demand what isn't ours, let's push and push until we run into firm steel, and then we might withdraw. We make no concession. We rely on the democracies and public opinion to demand some sort of compromise, and we end up then getting something that's not ours, to which we had absolutely no claim, but because the rest of them run out of energy, run out of resilience to stand up to us. It's a tactic they've used for a long time. It is something that all the former subject states of the Warsaw Pact felt very strongly. If you talk to Poles or the Baltic states or Romanians or Bulgarians, they're all pretty sick of having been ruled by a Russia for which they had absolutely no respect. These countries are very adamant that the NATO alliance must find ways of standing up more resiliently. We're doing quite well, but we have been a bit too slow about it. And as a result of that, the Russians are putting it out that the time is on their side, that the Ukrainians must compromise, that there will be Ukraine fatigue setting in the United States and elsewhere amongst Western countries. And if that did happen, then the result would be that Putin ends up with a chunk of, or large chunks of Ukraine, to which he has absolutely no legitimate claim. We have to help Ukraine to stand up to Russia so that Russia not only doesn't get what it's asked for, what it's demanding, but does further other countries, including, let's remember, NATO allies, because there are a number of countries which used to be dominated by, ruled by the Soviet Union, who are now members of NATO. And if they were invaded by Russia, then the rest of us would be obliged to go to war.
Yeah, and we say that that is something that even at this hour, Donald Trump perhaps is not convinced of, that he should stick to that NATO credo. Peter Westmacott, thank you so much. Really appreciate it as we continue to watch the arrivals here for that NATO summit.